So,
Excellent, that's you.
all right, okay. So I'll just leave it like that. All right.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Everyone's fantastic to have so many of you here. My name is Baron. I'm the UK Postgraduate Recruitment Officer here at the University of Southampton. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr Luke Blaxhill, who will be giving the funding talk. Luke is currently leaving an early career research fellow based at the University of Cambridge, working primarily on modern British political history, as far as I said, 1800 to the present day. And also the director of GradFunding, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, alternative funding source available for students, postgraduate students in UK universities. So Luke's going to talk a little bit about some funding generally, but specifically about the alternative guide, which you should have all got a copy of on CD. It's a fantastic resource, particularly if you're looking at self-funding your studies. So I'll hand over to Luke.
All right, thank you very much, Baron. All right, hi, so, money. This is probably why so many of you are here now in this room. Anyway, okay, so obviously one of the great challenges of postgraduate study, you've heard probably or thought about some of the academic aspects of it, but one of the principal ones is working out how you're going to pay for it, whether this is a master's or a PhD. Just sort of a brief show of hands, who here is interested in master's funding specifically? PhD? Okay, so maybe about a quarter to a third PhD funding. Okay, so this talk will take us through the major sources of postgraduate funding from the government, things like research councils. Also, I'll talk about the postgraduate loan. I'll also flag a few of the opportunities that are here available at the University of Southampton. But then principally, I'm going to talk about alternative sources of postgraduate funding. Now, these alternative sources of postgraduate funding are from charities, trusts and foundations, the many tens of thousands of small and independent bodies which are often set up by philanthropic individuals to help for various good causes. And one of those good causes could be your postgraduate study. I've already been introduced, so I shan't go over this again myself, but I funded my entire postgraduate degrees, which was a master's and a PhD, entirely through charities and trusts to about the equivalent of research council levels, so fees plus stipend. Now, in terms of who I suppose this sort of talk is aimed at, yeah, very much all postgraduate students, and charities and trusts can be used by all postgraduate students, whether you're prospective like you guys, or whether you are current students. So when it comes to charities and trusts or alternative funding sources, you can actually raise money after you've begun your course when you're already on it. With more mainstream funding sources, that's very seldom the case. Usually it has to be in place before you begin. Also, international EU and UK students as well, charities and trusts sometimes have slightly different rules for them, but broadly speaking, it's for students that are resident in the UK that matters. Also, for self-funded students who are entirely financing their master's or their PhD through their own resources, or people who maybe already have some partial funding in place, be that a partial scholarship or some other kind of arrangement that covers some of the money that they need. Also, charities and trusts can be used for fourth-year PhD students. This might seem like a long way in advance for some of you here, but PhDs often run into a fourth year, even if they're otherwise only funded for 3. And it can be used, this sort of funding, for fees and for maintenance costs, i.e. your housing, your food, your living costs, etc. And also for research, travel and conference expenses. These are particularly relevant expenses if you are doing a PhD. So, in this very brief talk, I'm going to be introducing mainstream bodies, but also alternative funding bodies as well. Tell you about how you can find these bodies through a variety of sources, books and the internet. I'm then going to show you how you should initially approach alternative funding bodies with an email or a letter to make sure you're eligible for them, and then I'll talk about how you can apply to these bodies to give yourself the best chance of success. Of course, this is a complex topic, and this is, in some respects, a whistle-stop tour. The CDs that Baron mentioned are of the Alternative Guide to Postgraduate Funding, which is essentially a book. The CD has got a PDF inside it, so you have full access there, and essentially this relays this entire methodology that I'm going to talk about now. From identifying these charities, to finding them, to initially approaching them, and then to applying strongly and correctly. It also has a list of 500 charities and trusts sourced by myself and my team in there, which will get you off to an excellent start when looking for charities and trusts. Although I'm also going to show how you can spread the net much wider than that and look elsewhere. Okay, so some sort of general super basic principles of postgraduate funding of all kinds, mainstream and alternative. The first thing is that getting a place on a course and getting funding are completely different things. Getting the place is usually much easier than getting the funding is. Now, in terms of the costs of postgraduate study, I mean, you probably already had a brief look into that. So fees, depending on the kind of program that you're doing, would be from maybe £4,000, around that, for example, for PhD fees for a home student, to £12,000, or indeed even beyond £12,000 for master's study. And that's for UK students. For international students, these fees are also higher. In terms of maintenance costs, you've probably got a good idea of how much it would cost to, to maintain yourself, housing and food in Southampton for the time that you would need to, budgeting for around £8,000 to £9,000 a year. And then maybe some extra study costs as well. In terms of fees, sometimes you can pay those in two halves as well. Now, in terms of the main sort of options that there are for postgraduate study from, if you like, all sources, the first of these is a full scholarship. Now, to get a full scholarship, this will mean you will have your fees paid and you'll get a full maintenance grant of around £1,000 a month. Now, these tend to either be from research councils, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute, but there is a main research council that supports each of the major 7 subject domains, and sometimes universities also offer full scholarships as well. Now, full scholarships are, of course, the absolute gold standard. If you get one of these, in many respects, you're laughing because, you will have all of the money that you need and, as I say, a substantial stipend for maintenance and maybe a little bit more research expenses on the side as well. However, full scholarships are incredibly, intensely, notoriously hard to get, particularly in subjects such as the social sciences and the humanities. In the sciences, they tend to be significantly easier to get because at PhD level, and sometimes at master's level, they are tied to specific projects under named supervisors. Like, for example, somebody who has a research grant to look at the neurogenesis of naked mole rats needs a PhD student to go and do whatever with cutting up some brains or whatever it might be. And so in a way, it's a little bit like working as part of a collaborative team and doing a job for a supervisor. But I'll say a little bit about the distinction between the science funding and the other funding later. The next thing is a partial scholarship. So this would be getting part of your course funded. This might be, for example, a fees-only award of perhaps £1,000 to £5,000. At the University of Southampton, there are the Vice-Chancellor scholarships, 100 of these at £7,000 each. That's also a partial funding award. Now, partial funding awards are also, of course, extremely difficult to get, but probably easier to get significantly than research councils. Partial funding is great, but it will still leave you probably with some kind of a deficit. You might be able to make that up through savings, you might be able to make it up through some kind of loan, or you might be able to make it up through charities and trust. Then, of course, there are entirely self-funded students. Now, at master's level, I think that this is the majority of students. At PhD level, it also might be nearing the majority of students as well. This is to say that you use your own money to finance your postgraduate course. Savings, part-time work, not park-time work as it says there, although it could involve working in a park, part-time or otherwise, generous people of any kind, bank loan, career development loan, and of course the postgraduate loan system, which has appeared in the last few years and will be appearing for the next academic year for PhDs. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Now, I said I would introduce these research councils. Well, as I say, there are 7 of them for the main subject domains. There's the Arts and Humanities Research Council, covering subjects like history, Economic and Social Research Council for social sciences, EPSRC, Engineering and Physical Sciences. I won't go through the other ones, but they all make awards for these particular subject areas. Now, research council funding is usually extremely challenging to get and is usually tied to particular departments. That is to say that individual departments will advertise the Research Council awards. They are usually attached to funded PhDs. Sometimes they are attached to funded masters. Sometimes they are attached to things called 1+3 awards, which are where you do a master's and then you upgrade to a PhD afterwards, effectively getting all 4 years funding. Now, because these are advertised by universities, it is at the universities that you should look. Now, sometimes they might be advertised on the university's jobs page, like, for example, with some of the engineering scholarships here at Southampton. But sometimes it may be that specific schools or departments will just generally run a competition whereby they will select the students that they want to take a certain number of scholarships that they have in their possession. So, for example, maybe the School of Arts and Humanities has 20 scholarships, and the students coming here apply to a competition, and then it decides which ones it's going to allocate. Now, one thing that's quite important here is most of these Research Council awards work at PhD level only. Some of them are 1+3 awards where you will do a master's and then a PhD, but there are very rarely scholarships that are for master's students only, particularly in the humanities and the social sciences. Now, of course, you're not compelled to do a PhD if you get a 1+3 award. Of course, everyone would very much like you to, and you've got a golden opportunity to continue, but nonetheless, you don't actually have to. But the thing with research councils is you will find a great deal of information about the whole process to do with them at the university you choose to study at. So have a look at the Southampton website. So I can probably add the most value to you by talking about some of the more obscure sources of postgraduate funding after I've done a word on postgraduate loans. Now, postgraduate loans were introduced in 2016 to 17 academic year. Now, for master's students, these are for all subjects, part-time and full-time, Home Plus EU students. They're not available for PGCEs. There are also some other quite specific eligibility criteria for certain, for example, for Scottish students, for students from Northern Ireland, and so it's very much advised that you have a look at the requirements on the gov.uk website. There's also an excellent list on the Find a University website on who can apply and who can't apply for postgraduate loans. Most students, home students that is, can, but there are quite a few small things, like for example, if you've already done a master's before, etc., that might disqualify you. They're not means tested, and they're paid off alongside an undergraduate loan, 6% of income over 21k. So by any commercial standards, they are a highly preferential loan. Do you want one, is the question? Well, this is a balance between taking advantage of this new funding opportunity, but clearly you're also incurring more debt on top of however much it is that you've already got yourself into doing an undergraduate degree. Also, a £10,000 loan probably is not going to be enough to pay for a master's lock, stock and barrel, because that's going to cover your fees and give you a little bit besides, but then you've got to look at maintenance as well. So you're probably going to have to look elsewhere, even if you take it out. PhD loans, I should also say, are coming for the 2018 to 19 academic year. They are £25,000 for the whole PhD. Again, that's nowhere near enough for what you would need, but it's still very helpful. Full details not available to you, available in this yet. Watch what the government says on that. Funding at Southampton, a couple of things I should draw your attention to. There's the PhD studentships. These are mostly for science engineering at the jobs.sutton.ac.uk site. There's an alumni discount scheme here, whereby if you are a current undergraduate of the university, you have been an undergraduate in the past, you'll get 10% off your fees for postgraduate study. There's also the Vice Chancellor's Scholarship, of which there are £107,000 per year funding for PhDs. Also, there will invariably be smaller faculty and departmental specific awards. Mostly these will be for travelling, for other expenses that you may incur, especially if you're doing a PhD or a research master's. Now, alternative funding sources, what you've really come to hear me speak about. Now, these are, as I say, these charities, trusts and foundations. Some of these bodies are a little bit bizarre and a little bit old-fashioned. Sometimes they don't have websites, sometimes they are not very well known about. And so this is one of the reasons why they are potentially very exciting. And there are also tens of thousands of bodies with their own eligibility criteria, their own rules, and, shall we say, their own consciences as well. Some of these charities and trusts aren't just box tickers. They genuinely are interested in hearing about individual stories. Why you want to go and do a master's, what extra employability skills you're going to get. And also, if you've had some bad luck along the way, you know, maybe you got ill at some point, maybe some other crisis happened that placed your funding in jeopardy. Charities and trusts often want to hear about it. You know, they can take into account individual cases. They are not like with some of the larger, more formal funding bodies. So to give some examples of them, there's one called the Sir Richard Stapley Educational Trust. This is for students that are 24 years of age and over. This is a very high success rate. It's pretty much for all subjects. Other ones getting a bit more bizarre. There's the Vegetarian Charity. This is for vegetarian and vegan students. Yes, I'm not quite sure exactly what the awards are for that, but that's for Masters and PhD level. The Leverhulme Trades Charities Trust. This was a charity that I got some funding from, based on the fact that my father used to sell biscuits in Grimsby in the 1970s. So essentially, the Leverhulme Trades Charities Trust, this is really great, this one. If you are descended from, I think it's just your parents, a grocer, pharmacist, or travelling salesperson, or indeed if you are one of those or were one of those yourself, then you're eligible for an award of up to £5,000 for postgraduate study. Also, £3,000 for undergraduate study as well, incidentally. Best Way Foundation. This is for students who have family connections to India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Millie Apthorpe Charitable Trust. This is for students with a connection to Finchley, North London. And then there are some much more manic kind of ones. So there's the Big and Tall Charitable Trust for people of 6'4" in height and over, which specifically gives grants to extend people's beds to stop your feet falling off the end and you being uncomfortable. The Royal Golf Charitable Trust is a charity for people who are good at golf. So essentially there's a man who lives in a shed in a golf course somewhere in Scotland, and you can go there to his golf course and challenge him, and if you defeat him, he gives you £5,000. Unfortunately, he's a sort of washed-up ex-pro, so I don't think he's ever been beaten. So anyway. However, I should say that your salvation is not based on being 6'4" or having a father who sells biscuits in Grimsby or defeating a man who lives in a shed in Scotland who is an ex-pro at golf. There are quite a lot of other charities and trusts, like the Sidney Perry Charitable Trust, the British Foundation for Women Graduates, which have much more mainstream eligibility criteria. And as I say, there are many charities to choose from. Why would you do this? Why would you dally with these weird and wonderful world of alternative funders? Well, I think the main reason is it's a plan B when plan A is very hard and quite likely to fail. So you can also build up a portfolio of awards. You can win many awards from charities and trusts. Over the course of my PhD and Masters, I managed to win 45. So you can win lots of them. And the more you win, this is the great thing, the easier it is to win even more. It's like a snowball rolling down a hill. The reason for this is because charities, generally speaking, dislike being the only funder of something. They like it when there are other charities in there, or part-time work, or savings, or loans, or lots of other things, and they feel as though they're one link in a chain, that they're running one stage of a relay race, not that they are simply being asked to fund something lock, stock, and barrel. Also, of course, unpredictable costs. I think that's fairly obvious sometimes. Unpredictable research costs if you're doing a PhD. Sometimes unpredictable maintenance costs. Your rent goes through the roof, whatever. And then writing up costs, maybe, if you're doing a PhD in the fourth year. Now, these charities and trusts, I say, they're not like research councils. They're very informal. And so you can pick up the phone to them and talk to them a lot of the time. There are thousands of bodies. Varying budgets. How much are awards? Usually in the £500 to £2,000 bracket. The trick to getting more money, as I say, is to build up a portfolio of awards to exploit that domino effect. Also, some of these charities, and this is the very important point here, are not always academic. They've been set up with members of the general public in mind, just as they have much as students. So they might be interested, for example, in looking at proposals to clean some graffiti off a wall in a local playground, or to help some kids put on a play or something at a local theatre, alongside your application to do your Masters in Pharmacology at the University of Southampton. So sometimes, because of that, you sometimes have to be if you're doing something quite research intensive and academic, you have to very much speak to an intelligent lay audience in your applications. Some of them are people that are skin. That's what it means by hardship. Some of them are much more about academic achievement. Sometimes the criteria varies for them. Sometimes it's subject for some of the academic ones. Sometimes age is an important one. Sometimes for people over the age of 24, sometimes people under the age of 26. Sometimes nationality is. Maybe you've got some particular charities for a given nationality, like the Anglo-Danish Foundation, for example, or maybe one for students from developing countries, like the Professor G.G. Montefort's Charitable Trust, or Churches Together, for example. There are also some professional bodies and learned societies, Royal Historical Society, for example, which give grants for travelling and things. But they are very diverse, and they're flexible. And one of the cool things about them is that there are multiple deadlines each year, very often. Not always, but very often. 4, 6, 12 maybe. And this all means that you can actually raise funding in advance of your course, or during it as well. Of course, it's a risk to begin a course when you don't have all the money for it, fairly obviously, and rely on beating a man at golf somewhere in Scotland to get you through. No, not really. But you see what I mean. You can do both with voluntary sector funding. Now, let's talk a bit about finding charities and trusts now. How are we going to find these things? I said sometimes they're very obscure. Sometimes It's very rare that they have no internet presence, but very often they will not have their own websites. That is quite common. So the way in which I like to advise students to go about this is to make a list of potential funders. Now, these are potential funders only, which are bodies which on the face of it look as though they might fund you. You're not going to know when you see a body, whether you read it in here or whether you look at it on the internet or you find it in a book in the library, whether it's a surefire funder for you until you actually ask them. So you have to note it as a possibility initially. Note lots of possibilities and then send out lots of email letters, and we'll come to that. 2 rules, though, when you are assembling your list of possible charities. The first is, don't discount a charity unless it's obviously inappropriate, because some of them are very, very flexible on how they distribute awards. The second is some charities only make awards to organisations and not to individuals. This is an important thing to be aware of. You will almost certainly be applying as an individual rather than as an organisation. And so, as a consequence, that may sometimes rule you out. Now, first place to look is online. By far the most useful place to look is online. There's your university's funding pages, of course. That goes without saying. I put it down online. I guess it's electronic in its own way. There's the Alternative Guide Postgraduate Funding, 500 charities here in the green pages. So definitely have a look through those. That ought to give you some really, really useful links. There are also some other websites as well that can be quite helpful. Scholarship Search, Postgraduate Studentships, Research Professional, and Uni Grants. Those are all quite university-centric kind of websites. Oh, another one I should say is find a university's site on this, which is postgraduatefunding.com. Now, there's charity search engines as well. Now, charity search engines are interesting because they aren't set up so much for students in mind, more for any charitable fundraiser. Now, most of these, like Charity Choice, GuideStar, Will to Charity, aren't so useful for individuals, but there's one that is, and it's called Turn to Us. Now, Turn to Us, I should say, is for students who are skint. And it's not the kind of thing that you're going to launch an application to and say, well, you know, I've got all the money I need, but I want to go on a Concorde to San Francisco to present my whatever it is at the gold-plated conference. Or whatever. Concorde's actually been grounded, but never mind. But you see what I mean. Obviously, ones like hardship charities, charities for skint people are very much for your maintenance, rent, living costs. But one thing I would say about the word hardship is a lot of students live for very little money. They live in conditions which, you know, universally, if you were looking throughout the population, are often considered as hardship. So just because, you know, you don't have to literally be starving or walking slowly to save on shoe leather to count as that. You don't adopt a Victorian definition. You know, a lot of students live like on canned beans and, you know, a candle and whatever. You know, that is definitely hardship in 2017. Now, some books as well, which are very helpful. Educational Grants Directory, the Charities Digest, the Grants Register. I think that's actually now been released online, the Grants Register. My image is for 2013, I apologise, but there's one for 2017 released, the Directory of Grant-Making Trusts. Now, these books can be found in any local library, almost by standard. You will also find in the local library some books about charities and trusts in your local area. Now, these could be local charities and trusts might fund you based on you living in a place for a particularly long time. I don't know, Basingstoke or whatever that might be. Or once you're here at Southampton, maybe look at some Southampton local charities. But you might have to ask a local librarian to show you some of those books. Learned societies, I won't say so much about those, but if you're doing a research master's or a PhD, you can Google society or Royal Society with your subject of study and you'll find some. Most of those, though, are for research, travel, and conference expenses specifically. You can also ask for advice. Ask at the education division of your local council. This can be quite helpful, you know, where you live. The reason for that is because sometimes local councils act as the de facto trustees of some charities and trusts that have lapsed into disrepair. Maybe their trustees have died, maybe their trustees have moved on, and sometimes these councils control some charities and trusts. So you could ask the education division there, I'm looking for postgraduate funding from charities and trusts. Do you know of any bodies that might potentially assist me? Also, if you can speak to any of the sort of person who works in a town hall or works in a local library who knows a lot about local philanthropic societies, there are all manner of things that exist on the local level, even at things like parish council level, which are there. And often finding someone who knows about these things in the local area is tremendously useful. Sometimes these sorts of people, if you get talking to them, are very happy to tell you a great deal about these local philanthropic societies and these strange things to do with the local area, because usually most people aren't interested in them. So there you go. Now, in terms of once you've found some stuff, what do you do? Well, you have to initially approach them. Condense your long list of funders that you've got into a much smaller, manageable list through writing letters, example letters of inquiry to charities and trusts. Now, these letters of inquiry, sorry, I said example letters of inquiry, these letters of initial inquiry should just state your name, your course, and when you intend to begin studying, if you haven't already, and should ask whether you might be eligible for any awards based on that information. Also put in your age and your nationality as well. There are some examples of what those letters should look like in the alternative guide to postgraduate funding, but they're very brief, simple letters. The long, complicated arguments about why you were unlucky about funding before or why your research is going to revolutionize the world, save that for your main application. This is just a simple initial letter of inquiry. If they've got an email address, email them with it. If they haven't, you'll have to use snail mail. If you use snail mail is a wonderful term. It's kind of a 90s term for people who are being very disparaging about the old postal services. Anyway, if you do use snail mail, include a stamped self-addressed envelope. This is an envelope with a stamp on it with your home address. If you don't do this, a lot of charities will not reply to you. This is, again, a very little-known factoid, but this is the reason why often people don't get replies, because there is no stamped self-addressed envelope. Now, send off these emails, send off these letters. If you send an email and you don't get a reply, you could send a letter. Oh, and of course, you can always phone them too. Now, when you do this, you're going to get loads and loads of disappointment, which is to say that most of the things you contact will ignore you. Or, for those that do reply, will go and say, well, no, this is only for people from the Isle of Man, or something like this. Or they'll come up with something very obscure that you haven't thought of before. But from this, you will get a few charities that come through and say, OK, let's hear your application. Here's the forms. Once you get that far with a charity, once they've invited you to apply to them, you've got a very good chance of getting the money. And furthermore, you have a good chance of getting that money renewed in subsequent years, because most charities will roll over that £1,000 into year 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 of a PhD, or maybe a part-time master's year 1 and 2. Now, in terms of general tips when applying, first of all, decide the body's priority. Is it an academic charity? Is it like the British Foundation of Women Graduates, which really wants to know that you've aced your undergrad? Is it a charity which is interested in, in hardship, and wants a story about, how things have been tough for you? Or does it have its own agenda? Is it interested, for example, in helping the sons and daughters of, biscuit salesmen or something like that? Obviously, if so, you should talk about biscuits. Now, you'll probably want a 500 to 800 word personal statement. Try and use strong arguments. Now, why should they fund you? Now, this will come down to several things. First of all, remember that charities and trusts won't see master's study, and certainly not PhD study, as something they just expect people to do. Nowadays, we accept that a lot of people just do undergraduate study. It's part of the process. It's part of what society accepts that many people do. Master's study isn't really like that. It's not part of the system. So they're going to want a reason why. Why are you doing it? Is it to make yourself more employable? Is it to prepare you for an academic career so you can do a PhD? There are all manner of arguments you can use about master's study, but they do want to know why. They want to know that you have a purpose, a vocational purpose, or an academic purpose. Also, if you're doing something based on research, a research master's, or a PhD, you need to make that research easy to understand to them, talk to them in lay language. Don't talk about specific academic references. Don't say Smith et al. 1993 didn't appreciate this, or I'm going to be, reassessing the post-Hegelian dialectic from a, sort of cultural discourse, crypto-feminist perspective or something. Don't use these sorts of words because they won't understand what you mean. If your PhD is about something that people have heard of, like bridges or a famous person or anything like that, then talk about that. If it has cute animals in it, talk about that. The kind of things that people like. If it's to do with saving people's lives, talk about that. But at the same time, don't make ridiculous claims like I'm going to cure cancer or anything like that. Because sometimes people with medical PhDs make very, very rash claims. You don't need to say that. Doing the medical PhD is enough on its own. Also, list other bodies that you have applied for or received money from. This is really good because it can embolden a charity to give you more. If they see that you've applied to 4 other charities, especially if you've got one of the awards, then it makes them think that, yeah, we're not just the only person this guy's applied to now. He hasn't just opened a book and stuck a pin in it. He's actually thought about it. Clear financial plan is an important thing to look at, and I'll show you that in a minute. And also, as I say, future career plans. Do you want to go into academia? What kind of work do you want to do? Why are you doing this work? I think I'll more or less skip this slide because this is about applying to research, travel and conferences. It's more or less the same thing, but you can be a little bit more detailed in some of your finances, like you know how much your hotel is going to cost, you know how much your plane is going to cost, that sort of thing. And this is really mainly for PhD students. Now, with the financial statement, I think we have a financial statement here. I'll just go straight on to that. The financial statement should do 2 things. Most charities and trusts want you to submit a financial statement, I should say, first and foremost. It, number 1, should say what you've already applied for and whether you've got it or not. The purpose of this is really to give the impression that you've got a plan that stretches beyond just one charity. And obviously, if you've got some charity funding already, then list that down. The other, which is much more important, is the table of income and expenses. Most charities will work on a yearly basis. The expenses are obviously going to be course fees, rent, utility charges, telephone, food, clothing, household miscellaneous, travel, etc. Income could be from another thing, many things. It could be from part-time work. It could be from obviously other charities and trusts. It could be from a partial award. It could be obviously, of course, from savings, and it could, of course, be from a postgraduate loan from wherever that comes from, or a loan more generally. And from that, you'll have expenses and you'll have income. Obviously, if your income's bigger than your expenses, the charity's probably going to say, well, what are you doing here, Governor? If you've got a deficit, in this case £6,000, the charity is going to want to have an idea that if the maximum award that they award is, say, maybe £2,000, where you're going to get the other £4,000 from. Maybe it's from these other charities and trusts. Maybe it's from doing extra part-time work. Maybe it's for taking out even bigger loans. Now, charities and trusts will understand that you don't want to just spend 5 days a week working during your masters, and they'll understand that you don't want to go and get a Capital One card and bankrupt yourself and bankrupt your family, but they do like the idea of there being a backup plan if the extra funding doesn't emerge. Because they want to feel that if we give this person the £2,000, they're going to use it really wisely, they're going to pay for their postgraduate course, they're going to bring it to a successful conclusion. Finally, references. Now, most charities and trusts will want one reference, generally speaking. This reference can be from somebody who knows you already at the university, preferably an academic. Now, this might be the person, for example, who has supervised your final year project or your dissertation, or just an academic that you know well, or is interested in your work or whatever it might be. The purpose of a reference for a charity and trust is mainly to say that you are who you say you are and you're not a scammer. That's not what the reference should say. It just would simply say that I can confirm that Susan is a master's student or is doing a master's at the University of Southampton. She's a really awesome student, etc., etc., etc. But some money would be useful. That sort of thing, really. Now, you can often get a supervisor to write you a generic reference with to whom it may concern or to dear sir stroke madam, and that means that you can use that reference to approach several charities with, rather than having to ask them to do a fresh one each time. Also, your supervisor should also ideally put this on headed, or your supervisor or the academic writing it should put it on headed paper, and also should use their university email address to correspond with the charity and trust, as should you as well, ideally. It looks better at coming from Southampton.ac.uk or wherever it is than it does from a Hotmail account or something like that. Not least because those things often get spammed. So that's the reference part, as I say, mainly so that they can be confident that you're not a scammer. It's not like with, say, big applications for academic jobs and things later, where how big the professor is who writes your reference really matters. With this, not really. It's more like an official stamp. Right, finally, and in closing, golden rules. First of all, make sure you're eligible for a charity and trust by contacting them first with that initial letter or email of inquiry, because a lot of students just send off applications to charities without doing that and then find that they're either not eligible or the charity isn't giving money out at the moment, or something like that. Understand a charity's priorities and tailor your application. Just a bit, though, because you want to be able to reuse your application for multiple charities. Tailor a bit of the paragraph at the beginning. Maybe you talk about your grades, maybe you talk about biscuits, whatever, but keep the rest of it very similar. If you're doing research, keep it simple, keep it lay. Try and show how your research might benefit society in some way in that case. That's also a very important thing. But don't overclaim, like saying you're going to cure cancer or something like that. Just make it sound interesting. If you can't claim a societal benefit, like me, you're a political historian, it's quite hard to claim a societal benefit, but just try and make it sound interesting. Try and show that you have a career plan, a reason for doing this, and that clear financial plan. And then finally, give it a shot. Ultimately, looking for funding from charities and trusts can be conceived of a little bit like as a gamble with your time. The more times you spin the wheel with this process, the more times you send out some of these initial letters of inquiry, the more applications you fill in, the better the chance you have of ultimately striking lucky. And when you do strike lucky, you'll have a better chance of getting further awards on top of the one you've already got. Okay, I'm at an end. I'll now happily take questions. Do we have any? Go ahead.
For doctoral programs,
Yes.
Some of them are obviously self-funding, but if you do manage to get a part-time funding, would they advise you through going the process, or do they have their in-house teams? When you say it's department-related sometimes.
Yeah, it will really vary from place to place, certainly. With this sort of funding, alternative funding, it's really going to be very much just between you and the charity. It's very unlikely that there'll be external stuff involved here. Now, it may be that with certain things, there may be some charities, for example, that departments may already be quite well acquainted with. Like, for example, Guarantors of the Brain, for example, for a neuroscience department. If you're a musician, the Countess of Munster Musical Trust. These are charities that have relationships with universities that are already pre-existing. The Lynn Grundy Charitable Trust, for example, is another one. And so they might know a bit about that, but for most of these other charities and trusts, it's just going to be you pretty much doing the research. And as for the stuff that they themselves administer, well, I guess implicitly they'll give you advice about that. If that is answering your question.
If somebody wants to approach charity,
yes,
who's the best person to potentially ask advice on their initial interest statement and then their follow-up? Can they go to somebody in the university or approach somebody to help them edit their approach?
Yes, there are. You can do that. It's certainly one approach. So certainly people at the Careers Service, for example, will be used to receiving kind of inquiries and requests about funding, whether they have this sort of, I guess, the spare resources to help each person literally write each statement. That's obviously a little bit more debatable, but they will have some local knowledge. That's true. But generally with charities and trusts, because the statements for them are really quite simple, and because you're literally just writing 500 to 800 words, it generally tends to be something that the student is very much doing themselves. You can certainly show the application to your supervisor as well. That would be interested academic, or indeed even the Careers Service or the Student Financial Advice team, and see what happens. I have known of many instances of those staff members, helping students to prepare applications. But at the same time, I've known many, many more of students literally just going it alone. Shall we have a split second? Well, you decide. You have a mini referendum and decide who. Yes.
If you're doing, say, a creative writing project.
Yes.
About something like epilepsy.
Yes.
A story about epilepsy. Could you go to? Is there any specific charities that would fund something like that?
Oh, well, that's a very, very specific question. Are there specific charities for creative writing about epilepsy?
No,
maybe.
But that would be a sort of a mental health that would have that.
Yes. Oh, I see what you're saying. So it is true that certainly if you have an emphasis, so with that kind of thing, first of all, most charities aren't research related, but of those that are, you would then have two potential angles for that example. One would be to go for a literature kind of charity or something like that, and another would be to go for a mental health kind of charity or something of that kind. And you might find indeed a charity more generally with sort of disability as one of its remits would be sympathetic to that kind of approach. And so certainly this is a good point, because if you're just creative about the way you think about things and think a little bit outside the box and think, maybe these guys might be interested in this, by all means send them an email. I did this with a lot of historical associations, for example. I did this with think tanks. It wasn't always successful, but a few times it was. So you can very much try and be enterprising and think about anyone else who might be interested. And the worst they can say is no, and even if they don't give you any money, you might get some interesting contacts out of it as well. That's another thing. They'll be beside you.
Should you have a place secured at the university before you start?
Okay, that's a very, very good question. Yes, I think you should. I think you should have an offer from a university. That I think is the entry point. Now, you could apply before that, but the problem is it just looks more flaky from a charity's perspective. If you say, I'm thinking about applying for a master's and I'm interested in raising some money in advance, it doesn't look so great, does it? I mean, it looks as though you might just, tap it in there and disappear. So they will almost certainly want an offer, and for prospective students of all kinds, usually they will not just give you a cheque. They will usually send a cheque that's to the University of Southampton or wherever it is you're going, and you will take that with you when you arrive and give it to someone in your department, and they'll either knock it off your fees or find some way of getting it back to you. So they will almost always make it contingent on you actually starting, for fairly obvious reasons. But I think it's much stronger when you already have an offer. And to be honest, it's still stronger when you're already there. But of course, that carries with it an implicitly greater risk because you've already started. It's also, I should say, finally, if you're at the end of a master's, at the end of a PhD, and you're just running out of cash, charities are really good at that moment as well, because they can really fly in there and try and help you out to get you over the line. You see what I mean? I think we have enough time for one more question, or I'll let Baron be another question. Go ahead here at the front.
Are international students eligible for Research Council funding or charity funding?
I'll answer in respect to charity funding. So charity funding, there's no hard and fast rule. There are some charities that are only for UK nationals, UK passport holders, but most charities are interested in residency in the UK. And that's more or less it. And if you're resident or going to be resident here for 1 year, 2 years, that's normally enough. Finally, there are also some specific charities for international students, from a variety of countries, the Noon Foundation, for example, Churches Together. With charities and with research councils, international students are not eligible for Research Council funding, no. I think EU students, obviously pending what's going on with you, are eligible for Research Council funding. I believe that is still true. Fees only award, exactly. There we have it. But international students aren't. There are some other international student fees, of course, like, for example, some of them that are available through the Foreign and Colonial Office and the British Council. They're very hard to get, though. But at the same time, that range of funding does exist in that case. Any further? Go ahead.
Do you have hard copies as well as the CDs?
Yes, I do have them. I do have some. If you might be interested in acquiring such a thing, then come and speak to me afterwards. Not really. But it's the same thing on the CD. We haven't just fobbed you off. It's just that this costs. I am but a poor man, and the CDs are a lot cheaper for me to produce than the book versions are. You see.
Right. I think then let's give a really big round of applause.
Thank you very much.
There will be another welcome talk in here, so for those of you who didn't get a chance to attend the first one, feel free to stay. For those of you who were here for the previous welcome talk, thank you very much for coming. It was lovely to see you all, and have a really good day. Thank you.